Joker 2 was already one of the most divisive movies of the year even before it was released, based on the general concept alone. I was one of the people, however, that wanted to go into it with an open mind, and I did, because I do enjoy it when filmmakers are allowed to take chances with comic book movie properties. That's how we got the original Joker, a movie that I still believe is a modern masterpiece, and it's one of those films that stuck with me long after I watched it. And that's exactly what makes Joker 2, now that I've seen it, all the more frustrating. Because I trusted the people involved because I had no reason not to. I trusted that they wouldn't have come back if they didn't have a brilliant idea for a sequel. And still, in the end, I felt surprisingly indifferent about this movie. Let's discuss.
I watch so you don't have to.
Struggling with his dual identity, failed comedian Arthur Fleck meets the love of his life, Harley Quinn, while incarcerated at Arkham State Hospital. I'll start my review off with a positive and say that Joaquin Phoenix is easily the best thing about this movie, to the surprise of absolutely no one. Joaquin Phoenix is not someone who approaches things in a half-assed manner. You can tell that he cares about what he is doing, and he's putting his all into the role just like last time. He was also surprisingly good in the singing parts, even if those moments don't necessarily 100% work. But more on that in a moment. I think the best parts of this movie, unsurprisingly, are when the focus is squarely on Arthur. That would mean his time in Arkham, or the time that he spends preparing for his trial. These are the next logical steps in his story, and that's why they worked. The biggest issue with Arthur Fleck in this movie is that I think the script fails him.
Get what you deserve!
This film is a lot of rehashing of things or events from the first movie, more so than it is covering new ground. And by that I mean his character doesn't really evolve. In fact, I would say, if anything, he regresses. To me, this movie was going to live or die by how Arthur Fleck was portrayed. And there's just not a lot going on character-wise this time around. As far as the newest and most predominant new addition to the cast, I did think that Lady Gaga did make a lot of sense to be this version of the Joker's Harley when she was originally cast. Unfortunately, as I was watching it, it felt more like they only casted her because she could sing. Because once again, there wasn't a whole lot character-wise that was memorable about her. I'm all for taking liberties with a character to make them fit into the universe you are creating. But you at least have to give me something. I just felt like this character resembled Harley Quinn in no way, and more often than not, her scenes are pretty forgettable. I actually think it would have made more sense from a story perspective to go a more traditional route and just make her his psychiatrist. At least we would have seen her slow descent into madness. That could have been interesting, as opposed to her just standing around singing a few songs and messing with Arthur's head. As far as the more controversial aspects of this movie, that being that it's a musical or has musical elements, I actually think that based on what happened in the original film, that this idea makes a lot of sense. I still think that it makes a lot of sense, but the execution was all off. Leading up to this film, I basically talked about how this movie is going to expand on the one scene in the original Joker after he kills the three guys on the train and then he dances in the bathroom. And that's pretty much exactly what happens. The only problem is that gimmick is used way too much.
What the hell am I looking at? When does this happen in the movie?
They basically went all in on the idea and tried to use it as an excuse to justify this movie's existence. If these two characters had a couple of moments in the film where they bonded over their love of music and performing, I think that would have made a lot of sense. I also assume that pretty much most of the musical elements would be in their heads, which is also pretty much what happened. They just go to that well far too many times throughout the course of the movie, and it actually starts to drag the film down. I get it. The original Joker was unconventional, and that is what people love about it. That's what I love about it. This movie basically feels like someone said, okay, let's go even more unconventional, but then they really didn't think about how it would impact the movie.
We're so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should.
In Joker 2, I can't remember a single song that was sung in this movie outside of the one in the trailer. And I just don't think they added anything to the movie in the way that the creative team thought they would. As far as the general look, I do think it's consistent visually with what we got in the first film. This movie is nice to look at. Gotham still has this retro, gritty feel to it, which I love, even if we do not get to see enough of the city this time around. As far as my biggest gripe with this movie, it easily has to be the ending. All the other stuff honestly could have been forgiven if they stuck the landing. I heard a lot of people freaking out over this ending when it leaked last week, and I kind of chalked it up to people being a bit too emotional about this movie for whatever reason, and I decided to continue to be optimistic. But now, having seen it for myself, I do understand how somebody could be upset by it.
You thought wrong!
I would venture to say that if you love the original Joker in the way that I do, that there's a very good chance that this ending is going to rub you the wrong way. But it just kind of screams of Todd Phillips or whoever made these decisions caving and giving into the whole Arthur Fleck Joker is not the real Joker narrative. It's like he heard people on the internet saying his Joker isn't enough like the Joker, and then retroactively tried to fix it. In reality, there was nothing to fix. This was Todd's unique vision for this character, and that's why many people loved it. For him to backtrack or give in to that talk is quite disappointing. And I'm not even sure that the twist or the swerve or whatever you want to call it even makes sense based on what we know. I heard rumors on the internet, and take this with a grain of salt for now, that this movie could have possibly been meddled with by the studio. I mean, given WB's track record, it does make a lot of sense, and it sounds like something that they would do.
Something very familiar about all this.
There have been people that have speculated that this film was chopped up in a similar way that Justice League 2017 was. Now, obviously, I don't know if that's true. It will be interesting to see how people talk about this movie the further we get removed from it. But it does feel kind of possible that this was a movie that Todd Phillips maybe didn't want to make. I don't know if he was obligated to make it because he had some kind of clause in his contract that said if the original was a success, he had to give them a sequel. While watching it, it does feel a bit messy and unfocused. Now, whether that's because the studio was giving him notes or changing a lot of things, or it's just because Todd got a bit too ambitious or maybe not ambitious enough. Whatever the reason, this movie does feel like multiple movies kind of stitched together. A far cry from the much more polished movie we got the first time around. I'm not kidding you when I say this movie feels like it was made by a completely different creative team.
Is it just me? Or is it getting crazier out there?
Listen, the bottom line is, this isn't the worst movie I've seen all year, but it is certainly the most painfully underwhelming and mediocre. I do believe that there is a good movie in here somewhere, and signs of that poke its head out from time to time throughout its 2-hour runtime, and I do give them credit for taking some big creative swings because that's exactly what this genre needs right now. Unfortunately, a lot of those big swings just do not land. And that is a risk you take when doing so. At the end of the day, as I said, I felt surprisingly indifferent about this movie. Did it need to exist in hindsight? Probably not. It's difficult to call this movie a cash grab with so many unusual choices being made. I would think a cash grab would want to keep things a bit closer to the chest. But again, in the end, choices were made, and the reality is most of them choices simply did not work. And that's why I'm going to give Joker 2 the careless Sam Gerard.
I don't care! Y'all be cool. Right on.